And for the purpose of tonight's talk, basically we're going to use the chat function. So basically, if you've got any questions as we go along, we would obviously love those questions, and we'll answer them as we go if possible. And obviously then at the end of the talk, we'll get the rest of them in as well. So we're hugely happy to be running this again. We had a really interesting one last year, lots of really great questions, so hopefully we get the same tonight. Obviously an area of huge interest to a lot of people, and obviously we want to see our females performing at their optimum throughout the season, and obviously throughout the cycle as well. So we're delighted to have Fiona Armstrong, chartered physio, and Sarah Nagle, dietitian and performance nutritionist, with us again tonight. Both have worked extensively in the inter-county game, and also both have very stellar playing careers with them as well. So I am not going to talk too long. I'm going to hand straight over to Fiona. Fiona's going to start off, and then we're going to go to Sarah, and then back to Fiona again. So without further ado, Fiona Armstrong.
Welcome. My name is Fiona Armstrong, as Eamon has just introduced me. I am a chartered physio here in SPARC. Welcome back to those who have heard this before, and welcome to everyone who's taken the time to tune into our conversation around female health tonight. This is just a brief overview of some of the topics we're going to discuss, such as periodization of the period cycle, menstrual cycle and performance, nutrition for performance, the female energy system, REDS in fueling, and an element of questions and answers throughout. Our goal tonight is to deliver evidence-based information on how to maximize your performance by tuning into your body. It is important that we note only 4% of sports science research has been done on females, down to the variation amongst females themselves. No two one of us are the same, be it with our menstrual cycle, physiologically, and then that echoes down to the kind of evidence-based stuff of sample size and I suppose sample number when it comes to research studies. What we do know is that there are many differences both psychologically and physiologically between the sexes, of which we dive into in further detail. But with that, it is noted that some of the evidence, while conflicting, is emerging, and lots of different evidence and topics of conversation we touch on tonight, you can individually apply to what's important to you or what you want to take out of this conversation. So, basic overview: why women are not small men. Female athletes want to be fitter, faster, stronger, meaning there is a requirement for that research for practitioners, coaches, and athletes themselves to understand what makes up a female. So I touched on that only 4% of the research is there. This is unlike males. Females were unlike males because, they can technically be defined as leaner, heavier, and have less hormone imbalances. So it makes them easier to study. There can be socio-cultural differences in between what I suppose activities people might participate in at a certain age. And the most primary driver between the differences is our hormonal differences. So males are epigenetically exposed to testosterone. This allows them scientifically to recover faster, have larger lungs, have larger hearts, and oxygen absorption, which allows them to actually technically recover faster. So that's why they can be quite good at that fast kind of work and that kind of quick exercise. Females, estrogen, you'll hear a lot of this hormone throughout our conversation tonight, but that is our primary hormone, and it has a huge role in our skeletal uptake, particularly amongst things like our Q angle of how wide our pelvis is. So that allows, I suppose, of what way our knees will fall, and that there's a little bit of emerging evidence that can actually have an impact as to why a male can run faster over 100 meters to a female, down to that fast twitch fibers. But again, that's only really emerging. We do know that women are better at beta oxidation and fatty glycolysis. So we're kind of better at that endurance, long distance, that kind of slower stuff. Another reason evidence may not be there or is only emerging at the moment is down to just society at the time, funding and education. But thankfully the tides are changing, and that this is our third year in a row kind of having this conversation, and each time we readdress it, there's a lot more kind of there, or a lot more conversation, and thankfully a lot more interest and kind of people tuning in again to take a bit more, because maybe it gives them a bit more context. When we apply that then practically, in the Olympics in Helsinki in 1952, there was only 10% of the participants were female. You bring it back to Tokyo, our last Olympics, and 48.8% were female. So on this slide, it's just kind of a combination of stats and statistics of what we do know about females' performance and menstrual cycle. 50 to 90% of athletes feel the menstrual cycle has an impact on their performance. 81% of high performance athletes have admitted to never speaking about their menstrual cycle, and 40% of 14 to 16-year-old girls feels their period stops them from partaking in sport. I think that last stat speaks for itself, that in my, I suppose, personal opinion on that means, you know, a girl can give up sports for any reason they wish, but being a female should not be a barrier as to your participation. So if we can chip away at that a little bit from tonight's conversation, or that we kind of have people here on this call who just normalize it. It doesn't mean that every conversation has to be your menstrual cycle, but that we don't do a disservice to young girls and potential athletes in the future. 80% of athletes have admitted to having no education on how the menstrual cycle influences their sporting performance. Again, we hope you'll come away with something more individualized to you after tonight's conversation. 30 to 50% of exercising women have disturbances in their cycle. 13% of women have a textbook cycle. Again, we explore that to a finer detail at a later means of what a textbook cycle is. What we do know is that information is power in order to aid performance, and that is across the board in all sports science. So if we can come away with things tonight that everyone can kind of understand and apply to themselves, then I would deem it quite successful. Men versus women, you know, we differ in muscle mass, strength, and maximal aerobic capacity and performance. This is the reason as to why we have this menstrual cycle conversation today. So I promise I won't let this become a biology lesson, but for those of us who probably the only conversation you've ever had about your period was end of primary school or maybe biology in school, that I'm going to break it down to phases. In general terms, I promise I won't talk too much, but that I suppose that everyone has an understanding, and maybe elements I touch on tonight, you will flag, hang on, that happens to me, or vice versa. So what is the menstrual cycle? It is our body's way of preparing for reproduction. It begins at 11 to 15 years, and it can be quite abnormal for 2 to 5 years, be it symptomatically, or you can get periods quite close together or with huge gaps. This continues 9 to 10 times in a year. This would mean on average about 457 times in a female's lifespan before they hit menopause. It is also important to note that 4 is the minimum volume of menstrual cycles you should have in a year. So anyone who's anything less, you know, you're dancing a line of needing possibly to have a conversation with a trained medical professional around that. I'm going to talk about 2 phases, but I appreciate that there, you know, certain literature or certain terminology out there can kind of explain that there's a few more. But what I want you to focus on in this graph is your follicular phase, your ovulation, which is that orange line or that orange arrow, pardon me, and your luteal phase. Your follicular phase is that early phase that I suppose the hormones I want you to tune in on is estrogen and progesterone. So think red line and green line. I dive into that a little bit more now in the next slides, but they're the most important means. And if we can just look at them ebb and flow, it is important that we do note that. Okay. So how do we tie this in to our cycle and performance? Okay. These 2 athletes here are both Team GB athletes. I think both are retired now, but just for purposes of context, we've Jessica Ennis on the left and Paula Radcliffe on the right. Jessica Ennis is a famous British athlete who previously has been quoted saying her period has been the difference of her finishing first and finishing last. And then contrary to that, you have Paula Radcliffe on the right hand side, who's an endurance long distance runner, whom in the Chicago Marathon in 2002 actually obtained a world record, but on the day she started her period. So what we do know over the last few decades, there has been an accumulation of modest volume of data exploring exercise, performance, and the menstrual cycle. We know women can safely and effectively and confidently exercise at high intensities without impacting their cycle or their fertility. The caveat, however, is energy expenditure, of which Sarah will go into in finer detail in a moment. It is important we note that everyone's cycle is different. Nobody really fits in that 21-day block. It can be 21 days to 35 days, depending on what's normal for you. But it is important that we do note the impact of estrogen and progesterone. So them green and red lines that I'm going to explain a bit more, they ebb and flow throughout a cycle, but estrogen in particular has a driver in our lungs, our heart, our brain, our GI tract, our mood, as it is an anti-inflammatory hormone, a feel-good hormone. It allows our muscles to recover and to help with bone growth. Progesterone on the other part is kind of a sleepy recovery, temperature regulation hormone. Okay. So the menstrual cycle, the first phase is that follicular phase. So if you look at the yellow star on display there, you have your mens, which is the red line at the bottom, which is the first can be up to 7 days of your follicular phase is your period. So your period essentially is inflammation of your uterus. Okay. Your estrogen and your progesterone are low. During this phase, people can feel a dip in their performance during your period compared to other phases in your cycle. Don't avoid training in this earlier follicular phase. Tuning into your body allows us to kind of do what works for us. If that we're taking an appropriate time to recover, that we're doing low intensity exercise. What we do know is that exercise is an anti-inflammatory, and it allows for endorphins to be released. So this can actually have positive impact. Around this time of your period, when these two hormones are quite low, people can present with cramping, fatigue, gastrointestinal discomfort, and all of these can impact our recovery if we aren't mindful of what to do about it. While no two people on this call will have the same kind of presentation, it is important that no matter how severe symptoms may present, that they are manageable, and they shouldn't be at a point where cycle after cycle that they impact your well-being day to day, but also from a performance setting. In the late follicular phase, which is just kind of past where I have that star, and you'll see the red line and the green line are ever so slightly separating. And this can happen around day 5 of your cycle. So generally just short of being after your period. And you have this increase in estrogen. So you have this increase in the red line and a drop off in the green line. So this can actually lead to a high degree of motivation. You feel good, you feel motivated, and it's a good time to strength train or explosive power train. And often in this time, because of that peak in that red line, that estrogen, that anti-inflammatory, people actually even note a reduction of DOMS. Now, it obviously depends on what you're doing or whatnot, but that you may find that you're even able to recover that bit faster. So ovulation is the middle section of the cycle. It is one of the most researched sections of a female cycle. You have this drop in progesterone and this peak in estrogen. And this can help with strength and power gains. You're feeling really good, you're feeling strong. But it is important to note that this is the time in I suppose, the science side of things where your egg is released. And inevitably our bodies, the evolution, their role is to prep for reproduction. So at this phase, that estrogen can have an impact on your ligaments and your ligament laxity. So in this area, the research shows that we are actually 3 to 6 times more likely than males to rupture an ACL during this period in a non-contact ACL. Okay, everyone rolls the dice in a contact, but it is important that we don't use this as a scaremongering or a fear point, but just that we look at what we can control, what we can compare, and how do we make ourselves more robust. So looking at focusing on your warm-up, your mobility, technique to what you're doing, actually giving yourself the time to achieve something correctly. Strength train is one of the most important themes we're going to carry throughout this conversation tonight. But single leg strength should be an essential exercise in all female programs, be it quad strength, single leg landing, or lateral hip, that being something that demands you to land planting to the side. So these are things you can be mindful of. And the most important thing that we talk about tonight is information is power. And then we have our luteal phase. So our luteal phase is that final phase in our menstrual cycle, where you again see estrogen is peaking again. You have progesterone also alongside it rising. This can happen 10 to 12 days before your next period. That green line is passing out the red line. So your progesterone is increasing kind of a bit higher than your estrogen. And this is your calming hormone and has a role in sleep and recovery. We know estrogen has a role in anti-inflammatory. So sometimes people can report because that progesterone nearly inhibits estrogen, you're feeling really lethargic, you're feeling like your fluid retention, you're feeling nearly your body temperature is increased, you're bloating, so you can control in this phase your sleep, your recovery, your hydration. So while the estrogen is good for aerobic performance, emphasis should be there on that recovery. So during your late luteal phase, you'll see both of the lines start tapering off, and this can lead to what we call premenstrual symptoms. So 90% of women experience PMS on days leading up to their period. Research has shown that for 2 consecutive cycles of low intensity exercise, such as walking or yoga, and that's not to say they replace your training, but outside your training, that you're doing things to kind of get on top of them, and either you do a bit of yoga before training. That, it doesn't mean that everything is rest and recovery. It just means how you can implement that little bit of nugget of information, of how your body reacts to kind of dial that down. And with that, because of that kind of PMS means a lot of people also report sleep disturbances. So 25% of females report sleep disturbances on the days leading up to their period, with 35% of females actually reporting sleep disturbances during the period. So it is important that we are mindful throughout our body. We have receptors for our muscles, these hormones, and this all influences the size of our muscle, how we recover, and how we feel when we train and perform. So with that little kind of dive in information and kind of biology, I'm going to introduce Sarah Nagle, who is a performance nutritionist and dietitian, who's going to kind of put a little bit of the nutrition aspect to what we've explained there, so that it can just make it a bit more relatable in your guys' head. All right, so I'm just going to bring Sarah in here.
Thanks a million, Fiona, and hi to everyone. It's fantastic that we're running this kind of for 3 years in a row, and there's still a huge amount of interest in it. So welcome everyone on this lovely Tuesday evening. So exactly like what Fiona was saying in terms of the evidence that we have at the minute in this field, still quite limited. And I just really want to emphasize that there's nothing 100% concrete about this. The domain of sports science is very new. And on top of that, the domain of performance nutrition is even newer again. And similar to a lot of the evidence that's been done in sports science, the evidence that's been done in performance nutrition, over 90% has been carried out on male athletes. And there's kind of a common theme that, the findings of these can be transferable to females. And, that's just not good enough. So it's good to hear that over the last kind of 5 years in particular, there's been a huge change in terms of doing a huge amount more data collection and trials in female athletes. So I just really want to caveat that when we go through the kind of recommendations for nutrition, it's still quite limited. So we'll be looking at energy intake, what that means and how that can impact individuals' performances, looking at then kind of key micronutrients and macronutrients then to kind of take us through that. So when we're looking at energy availability, and this is something that myself and Fiona have kind of touched on, and Fiona will touch on later again, that term is something that people kind of often say, look, what does that actually mean? And to put it in kind of, I suppose, an equation, energy availability is the energy that we intake, take away the energy that we expend. So energy that we intake, I suppose in simple terms can be calories, but we need to go one step further in thinking, well, where are those calories coming from? So is it carbohydrate? Is it protein? Is it fat? And then take away that expenditure. And often people just think that the expenditure is when you step out into the pitch, or when you go for your run, or when you go into the gym. But everything that you do to stay alive expends energy. And that's something that we really need to take away from. And if there's anything that I suppose you take away from this part of the talk from me is asking yourself, am I eating enough? Am I taking in enough energy? Do I have enough energy available to carry out my day-to-day things, to get onto the pitch, to go for a run, to go to the gym? Just ask yourself that. Another term that we're going to be discussing is then low energy availability, and one step further being REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And this essentially, both terms have been coined quite recently, kind of in the last 5 or 10 years. But essentially what that means is the energy that we're expending is not enough to do the energy that we're intaking is not enough to meet the energy that we're expending. And often people are not taking enough energy without knowing that they're not doing it. And that's one thing. So one of these low energy availability, or REDs, can be involuntary, where in which the individual does actually not understand or know how much energy they really need to take in. And then sometimes it can be voluntary as well, where in which someone is purposely, whether it's to do with restrictive eating, or, you know, if there's any kind of eating disorder behaviors there, not taking in enough energy as well. So if anyone on the call is a coach or is seeing any of these behaviors in any of athletes that they work with, so it's very important that we're kind of getting behind, I suppose, the reason where in which there might be an energy mismatch or imbalance. And looking at then, I suppose, what relative energy deficiency in sport means. So this term, and Fiona's going to go into it in a bit more detail when it comes to performance, but from a whole kind of physiological point of view as well, maybe back in the 80s, there was this phenomenon called the female athlete triad, and you'll see it there. It's the red triangle there, and it was found that amongst female athletes, particularly those that engaging in ultra endurance type of exercises, that they would present with low intake of energy, menstrual dysfunction, and issues with their bone health. So they might present with stress fractures, and they found this was quite common, where in which low energy intake or over exercising caused reduced production of estrogen, which then affected bone health. But actually what we know now in the last couple of years is REDS extends much more beyond that as well. It impacts a lot of our different physiological physiological performances in the body as well. So it can affect things from our gut to our immune system, to our cardiovascular system, our endocrine system as well. And it's just to kind of bear in mind that it's not necessarily a loss of period or stress fractures that can indicate that someone isn't fueling correctly or that someone isn't taking on enough. There can be a lot of other signs and symptoms before we get to those stages, just to keep an eye out on. And that again just kind of highlighted the female athlete triad. So that was kind of the building blocks in the 80s. And over the last number of years, thankfully, due to more science that's been carried out on both male and female athletes, because REDS does occur in male athletes, this has kind of been found that as well. It's not just menstrual function, bone health, and kind of low intake of food that is affected. It's a lot of other different biological functions in the body as well. And I'm going to go back to this point, because this is just something that, again, if everyone can take home one point from my part of the conversation is, am I eating enough? We really have to appreciate how much our body does on a day-to-day basis. So like the average human brain should need up to 8 slices of bread in a day just to keep functioning. And that's before you even think about your lungs working, your gastrointestinal system working, your cardiovascular system working. And that's again before you even think about the cost of getting up in the morning, making food, going up and down the stairs, sitting on the couch takes up energy. And then again, you're thinking about, okay, add on top of that, going to work. Are you in kind of a labor intensive work? Are you on your feet the whole time? Even if you're on a desk job, your brain is using up a huge amount of energy. Okay. If you're in school, again, we all remember being in school and it's a long day, a lot of energy being used up by our brain, chatting to your friends, those different things. And that's, again, all that energy has been used up before you step out into the pitch, before you get into the pool, before you're, going onto the track. So we really have to kind of emphasize just how important it is to kind of fuel for our everyday to-day lives. And then on top of that, fueling for our performance. So just that's kind of one thing. To kind of build on some of the nutritional kind of signs and symptoms of low energy availability and REDS. So that kind of piece where in which we're not taking on enough fuel, and there's a mismatch in the energy that we're putting out. Different signs and symptoms before we get to amenorrhea, which is the loss of period. We can see different things like fatigue. Someone isn't getting adequate fuel, therefore they're tired. Another kind of phenomenon that we do see is if your body goes to bed and it's not taking on enough fuel, what your body is subconsciously doing is actually searching for fuel. And if it's not getting it, it's keeping you awake at night. So if anyone kind of struggles to get to sleep, that can be another sign that you're not fueling correctly throughout the day. Digestive upset is still another thing that we see quite commonly. And this again is just something to bear in mind, that our gut is a muscle, and muscle needs energy to fuel. And sometimes when people aren't fueling enough, what tends to happen is food isn't being released as it should. So therefore food kind of sits in our gut, it gets fermented by any of the gut bacteria that we have, and can cause digestive upset, like things like bloating, things like diarrhea, constipation. And often what can happen in these type of cases is people can get misdiagnosed with things like IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. And in the treatment of IBS, there's an elimination diet as well, where in which you restrict intake of certain types of foods, which in someone who has been misdiagnosed and someone who is already kind of not taking enough fuel, that again can be quite detrimental to that person as well. We see a recurrent illness as well. This again can be because our body isn't, giving enough fuel to our immune system. Therefore, our immune system has been down-regulated, and different kind of we see, particularly in kind of people who do a lot of endurance or a lot of miles on the clock, certain viruses tend to pop up a lot in that population, depending on how much fuel they've taken in. Again, injury is something that we can see quite commonly in someone with low energy ability in reds, and the reason behind this is if we see kind of estrogen being dropped off in someone who isn't, say, for example, in the likes of females, that is protective of our bones. So we can see a lot of stress fractures in individuals who are not fueling enough, but also we can see a few kind of soft tissue damages as well. The role of estrogen and testosterone in males and females is often to protect those kind of injuries. So if you're an individual maybe who's picking up injuries and not necessarily recovering as your physio is expecting or your doctor is expecting, ask yourself again, am I fueling enough? Amenorrhea, and we'll discuss that more. Reduced performance as well, and this is something that can be quite frustrating for athletes, that they're not getting the outcomes that they feel they should be. They're in the gym, they're trying to lift heavy, but they're not getting the PBs that they want to. And again, that can be down to they're not eating enough. Also think about it from the point of view of our body needs growth hormone to lay down more lean muscle mass, more muscle. If you're not fueling, your body isn't producing enough growth hormone. Therefore, those different changes in our body will not happen. Poor concentration again is another one, because our brain isn't getting the fuel, and also feeling cold. This can be due to the low body mass, but also can be down to the fact that thermoregulation can be disrupted in low energy availability in reds. So again, tapping into these kind of different things that we might see commonly and kind of asking yourself, do I fall into any of these? How I like to talk about fueling with people at the minute is we can all kind of, think about our phone, and we do not like it when we go out and our phone's at 20%. It's not low power mode. Things don't work, phone calls don't work. The camera on the phone doesn't work. If you want to watch a video, won't download very well. Anyone on the call is on TikTok or Instagram. Again, it just doesn't work for us. And we get kind of nervous and anxious if we're going out. We could be 3 or 4 hours and our phone's at 20%. It's not a nice feeling. I want everyone to think about it. If you're going out performing, you don't want to be in that red zone when you're going out. Think of yourself like your phone. We at a minimum want to be at that 80% charged. And that comes from making sure that you've eaten enough as well. Lower down that fueling. So anything kind of less than 60%, you're really putting yourself at risk of poor performance, injury and illness. So ideally, when you're going out, whether it's to training, to a match, to competition, and also after that as well, you're thinking about, am I fully fueled? Have I taken on enough? Can I do more to get up there? Because the last thing we want to do is risk, firstly, poor performance, but also injury and illness as well. This is kind of quite a topical piece in the kind of performance nutrition role. And, there's a lot of people kind of saying that, oh, look, at this day of your period, or day 14 of your period, day 21 of your period, you need to eat X, Y, and Z. And like at the minute, the evidence just isn't there to say specifically, on day 1 of your cycle, you need to eat this, and day 2 of your cycle, you need to eat this. What I would say though, and it's something that we'll talk about, and Fiona's again is going to bring up again, is making sure that you're tapping into yourself and you're kind of talking to yourself and seeing what worked well for you at one stage of your cycle versus the next day. Okay, because the evidence is limited here, but that's just because we surely just don't have enough evidence to say that. Whereas if you're kind of tapping into yourself and documenting and using a diary in terms of that, this can be really powerful in terms of how food can play into different types of your cycle. So there is a few different kind of ideas. And again, I do want to say that this is still very much in its infancy. But in that kind of follicular phase, particularly towards the late follicular phase, where you might be feeling stronger, you might be lifting heavier in the gym, your recovery might feel a bit better, really focusing on making sure you're getting enough carbohydrates to fuel that performance so that you are meeting those PBs. Also during the follicular phase, the time that you actually do bleed. So iron-rich foods to replace any of the blood that you've lost are particularly important during this. So whether you're an individual who eats meat, red meat sources, and I'll talk about that later, are a really good source of iron. Anyone who kind of follows more of a plant-based diet, again, just being educated on the different types of food that you need to eat to make sure that you're getting enough iron, because iron is crucial from the point of view of carrying energy around your body, making sure that your immune system is tip top, but also making sure that you're not feeling tired as well. And that's the big thing that iron does. So particularly during that phase when you're losing blood, it's really important to get enough iron on. Then the luteal phase, and particularly around the time that, people mightn't feel this, and if you don't feel this, again, this mightn't apply to you, but again, it's just certain ideas and kind of concepts that have been thrown around there. In that luteal phase, things might feel a bit harder for you than they typically would. And some people have kind of anecdotally reported that, say, for example, if they're going on a long run over 10K, or they're out for a run longer than an hour, and they might rely on carbohydrate-based gels, maybe one gel this time isn't enough. Maybe you need two, because sometimes what happens during the luteal phase is our body isn't able to extract the carbohydrates that we have in our muscle and have in our liver as well as it usually would. So you might just need to rely on external forms of carbohydrate during this phase, particularly if things are feeling a bit trickier or harder for you. Also, this might be a time in which your core temperature increases, and with that, your sweat rate might increase as well. So it's really important that you're focusing on fluids. And look, nothing here is very, different or new than what you would be doing, but it's just different concepts to kind of be thinking about as well. Anyone, has any kind of tracking devices that they use, where it's smartwatch or different types of things like that, you might note an increase in your core temperature around this time. So just be thinking, if you're feeling that your sweat rate is increasing, making sure that you're on top of your fluids around this time. And then ovulation, as Fiona was discussing, this is a time when there's quite a lot of inflammation around the body. And again, a few different ideas that are kind of been thrown out at the minute is focusing on omega-3 rich foods, because these are types of foods that have a lot of anti-inflammatory properties in them. So the likes of oily fish, nuts, seeds, oils, and also antioxidant rich foods like the likes of fruit and vegetables, like the likes of nuts as well. These can help alleviate kind of that inflammation around the body as well. These are also particularly important at all stages, so are the other nutrients that I was speaking about, at all stages of the menstrual cycle, because again, if someone is performing at a really high level, we need to make sure that we're kind of keeping inflammation in the body at a minimal as much as we can. Okay, so macronutrients. So these are the main nutrients that we need as female athletes. So carbohydrates. Now again, these have been demonized for some reason over the last number of years, and our body's preferred fuel source are carbohydrates. It's what our brain wants to use, it's what our muscles want to use, it's what our liver wants to use. That's what the evidence is saying. So for anyone on the call who kind of just follow more of a low carbohydrate diet, just kind of consider that as well. So there's two different types of carbohydrates that we like to break them up, and both do play a role in terms of performance. So complex carbohydrates tend to be the ones that are higher in roughage, let's say. So what complex carbohydrates do, they're the more brown bread, brown rice, brown pasta, beans, legumes, those types of foods. What they tend to do is provide us with a slow release of energy. So they might sustain you throughout the day and keep your blood sugar levels at an even keel. The simple sugars are the ones that, because they're already quite broken down already, they're more simple, and that's the reason they're given that name, is they're more broken down. They tend to give individuals these quick releases of energy into their bloodstream. So these are quite useful. Say, for example, if throughout the day, you've kind of focused on your complex carbohydrates, but it's just before you go out into the pitch, it's just before you're about to compete, those 30 kind of 60 minutes beforehand, those simple sugars can be really useful in terms of giving you that other kind of kick and replace any of the carbohydrates that you might have already used up as well. So it's, they both have a role, and they're both really useful, particularly when it comes to performance as well. So just kind of have a think about that. Also, when it comes to carbohydrate intake as well, like athletes who are performing at really high levels, or anyone who's really active throughout the week, we do need more than someone who, say, isn't as active as us as well. So just consider kind of different portion sizes as well. And again, it's just important that, you know, if you do have individuals in your life who aren't as active as you, you're not necessarily comparing yourselves to them when it comes to carbohydrates. We need a huge amount of carbohydrates to fuel our performance. Question that always gets asked, and it's just something to kind of have a think about as well. Again, this is really individualized, and what works for some people might necessarily work for others, but always you get asked, look, what should I eat on the day of competition? And the number one rule that I would say to anyone is make sure you practice it first, okay? Because, you know, we want to keep everything as standard as possible going up to a big day of competition. So make sure you practice this first. But the general rule of thumb is have your main meal 3 to 4 hours out of competition. This kind of should largely be based on carbohydrates, and ideally the easily absorbed ones. So some people can take, you know, some people don't mind tolerating kind of the high fiber brown bread, brown rice. Some people, because they might be a bit nervous, need to focus a bit more on the white versions, and that's absolutely fine too. Find what works well for you. But that's your main meal, and that's really mainly focused around carbohydrates, moderate amount of protein, a minimal amount of fats. Then 30 to 60 minutes out, focusing on those simple sugars again, getting that really quick release of energy that you need. You know, you might have to drive somewhere to get to the place that your competition or training is on. You might have had to do a warm-up beforehand as well. All those things are using up energy. So we really want to go out to competition, making sure that we're fully fueled as well. And those things in the middle section of the screen there are really handy just to have in your kit bag, handy to have in the car. I would always say to athletes that I'm working with, have them in the boot of the car, because you can never really go wrong having them spare. And then with 1 hour afterwards, you're really focusing on a few things. You want to refuel, so get on any carbohydrate that you've lost during that competition, rehydrate because you'll have sweat, you have lost a lot of fluid, and also then repair with kind of protein-rich food. So again, and I'll discuss them in the next kind of couple of slides, but they're just a few different ideas as well to kind of give you a few examples. Protein. So protein is one of those ones that you know, everyone talks about protein, everyone wants to know about protein, and it's really important for athletes, but it's not the only macronutrient that we need to consider. So we always need to consider carbohydrates, protein and fats all together. But essentially protein is needed as it's the building blocks of our muscle and lean muscle mass. It also is needed to repair any muscle that we damage, which we inevitably will do every single time we go out to train. What's important now, and what the evidence is showing at the minute with protein, is it's not necessarily the sheer amount that you're taking. What's really important is that you're getting consistent protein throughout the day. Kind of typically, we tend to eat, as Irish people, I suppose, you know, minimal amounts of protein for breakfast, moderate amounts for lunch, but we tend to eat a huge amount at dinner time. When as an actual fact, what the evidence is now saying is consistently throughout the day, we should be kind of getting moderate amounts of protein as well. So just to have that in the back of your mind. And the reason that is protein is kind of a signal to our muscles to make more muscles or to repair any muscle that we've lost. And again, depending on whether you include animal sources or more plant-based sources, there's just a few different ideas in the bottom of your screen there as well. Fats, again, are a really important energy source. Again, kind of thinking about that energy intake that we're speaking about and being part of that equation. They're also really important fat-soluble vitamins. They provide us with things like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. Also then from a general health point of view, for our brain and cardiovascular health as well. Ideally, we're kind of focusing more on those kind of omega-3 side of things and polyunsaturated fats. But again, they're a really good source of energy. So again, thinking about them. What I would say to you when it comes to kind of including fats in your diet is try to keep them minimal before you go out to train or before you go out to competition, because what fats tend to do is they slow down the release of carbohydrates because they kind of sit in your stomach and bind with carbohydrates. So they kind of slow down the release of that. So if you are having a meal before that kind of 3 to 4 hours out, try to get it a little bit low fat. So avoid using things like loads of butter, loads of cream, frying things in oil, those kind of bits. But anything like other than that should be absolutely fine in your pre-match meal. And micronutrients. So the one I am going to discuss is just iron, because I had a slide on that earlier on, and just to show the difference that female athletes need versus kind of the general population, male athletes. So you'll see at the top there, the female athletes need 18 milligrams a day of iron. And that in comparison to males is over half. So male athletes need 8 milligrams a day, and non-athletes who are females need 7. So it just shows the sheer amount of iron that women need when they're competing and training as well. And just be really mindful of that if you're the type of person who kind of is chronically feeling fatigued, feeling low in energy, picking up colds and flus, again, checking into your energy intake, but also checking into your iron intake as well. If those kind of things are happening, definitely get onto your doctor to get any blood tests done that you feel that you might need as well. And that comes down to anything, if you know, and Fiona will discuss that as well. But if you lose your period, whatever, you know, you need to discuss it with a medical professional. And the different types of iron that we do have, they can be kind of broken down into easily absorbed and not as easily absorbed. And what you kind of see the trend there is the easily absorbed one are animal sources of iron, whereas the non-easily absorbed ones tend to be plant sources. And the reason the animal ones are more easily absorbed is they come in a form of that's called heme iron. The kind of general rule of thumb is the redder the meat, the higher the iron is. But then again, things like poultry, so your turkey, your chicken, things like eggs or oily fish or different types of other shellfish, they will also contain a moderate amounts of iron too as well. So they're quite good versions of them or sources of them. The not as easily absorbed ones, these contain a type of iron that's non-heme iron, and they tend to be kind of dark green leafy vegetables, the likes of tofu, so their soya products, any kind of fortified breakfast cereals also might have a good bit of iron in them, or pulses and beans. And again, what I would say to you about these is, you know, they're not as easily absorbed, but there are tricks to increase the absorption of them. So say, for example, if you're eating them, what I would say is if anyone's a tea or a coffee drinker, don't have tea or coffee 30 to 60 minutes around these sources of iron, because what those things have is a thing called tannins, which can inhibit the absorption of iron there. What is a good drink to have is a source of vitamin C. So if it's orange juice, have that around the not as easily absorbed iron, because what the vitamin C does is it changes that type of iron into the easily absorbed iron as well. So there's definitely tips and tricks to increase the absorption from those as well. But again, it's kind of just knowing those, and education and knowledge is really important in this sense. So I'm going to leave you there with that. So I suppose the takeaway points is, you know, the evidence is really still emerging in this, particularly when it comes to performance nutrition, and then one step further, kind of performance nutrition and specific advice for female athletes. But it is, you know, it's an exciting time. There are a huge amount of interest at the minute, you know, in this field. We should always, regardless of what we're training for, what we're doing, individualize nutrition interventions for athletes. One size definitely does not fit all. And it's just really making sure that, you know, if one thing works for some person, it doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work for the other. And as always, we've kind of alluded to, if you have any concerns, definitely discuss it with a medical professional or GP. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Sarah.
I think Eamon, we're going to answer a few questions.
Before we could go on, Sarah's jetting off the training now. So is there any questions for Sarah? If you want to pop them in the chat box there, that'll be great. We'll give you a second, Sarah, and then we'll let you off.
Yeah, take your time. Thanks, Mel. I think, Eamon, there are 4 questions already, or they might be specific to Fiona, is it?
Not in my chat box anyway.
That's strange, James. I pressed escape.
Oh, sorry. Oh no, that's perfect. No, Eamon, that was you. So
deadly. I think we can push on. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks for being involved again this year. It's great to have you, and it's great to get that kind of information from an expert such as yourself. So brilliant. And we will talk to you again, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, guys, 1 second there now. I'll just get back to sharing this here. Now, so lots of topics that Sarah touched on there. I won't echo too much, but I'm just going to probably dive in a little bit more to that kind of physiology and just kind of put things in a little bit more context. And if people kind of, when we briefly touch on them, often these things, and we kind of reiterate it, gives you a better chance and understanding to kind of, I suppose, catch a hold of what we're trying to explain. To begin with, it is important that I emphasize that abnormalities in the female cycle should not be assumed to be associated with exercise unless physiological and psychological causes have been ruled out. Okay. So amenorrhea is no period. Okay. So amenorrhea, your period stops due to an estrogen deficiency. In the absence of a pathology. So what we've learned about a lot of the estrogen on the topic that I had discussed pre to Sarah's conversation, that kind of low level, it peaks and then it peaks again for a second time at the end of our phase. We know estrogen is a bone protecting hormone. We know that in females, we generally acquire kind of our bone mass close to 18, but our peak bone mass is between the ages of 25 and 30. And then from there, bone loss occurs faster than bone absorption. So if we think of, that's just one role of what estrogen can have. So when it is absent and it stops our period, obviously that can lead to a cascade of effects throughout our body, from a muscle recovery, bone density, and just general motivation and energy standpoints. Three causes of things that can lead to no period is you can have psychological stress, excessive exercise stress, underfueling, which is the stress to your body of what Sarah explained there, or a combination of all three. This is known as the female athlete triad: REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, or functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. These are just terms, interchanged and used throughout the literature. It depends on, each year there's one that's more important. But again, because there's just been a series and a block of information over the last number of years, I have them up there for context. If anyone on this is a coach or someone who just takes honest interest in it, that you might find these terms give you a bit more context. The most important thing here is REDS is a medical diagnosis. And what I'm explaining in the next few slides are flags. They can present individually, which is quite normal, okay, when I break them down, but that when they appear in the absence of a period, that this is what we're looking for, in that people kind of flag, hang on, that's not normal. Obviously then, amenorrhea in itself can have health and performance impacts, okay? We've said it a few times, abnormal is normal. Everyone has that individual cycle. But just when things change, okay? So what to look for? Amenorrhea is so the absence of a period for greater than 3 consecutive cycles. So there can be multiple times in your life where particular stress in work or life and your period does kind of go missing. But what we're saying for here is that it can be over 3 consecutive cycles. You've low energy availability, as discussed with Sarah. That seesaw is just, you're completely flat and you're really finding it difficult to kind of give more. Significant weight loss, and you can actually have significant weight gain as well, can also be a stressor, be it with depending on situations in your life, or if it is from our competition standpoint, that if that seesaw swings too much one way rather than a gradual kind of equilibrium, you can get this a knock-on effect. Stress fractures, again, estrogen, bone density, we've echoed that throughout tonight's conversation. So these aren't necessarily the injuries that you come in with the mechanism of injury. These are the ones that kind of present over time, they don't heal very quickly, or your overuse injuries where you're coming in with one thing, 3 weeks later you have another thing, 6 weeks later you have another thing. And it's not always REDS, as I've said, but there are sometimes, it's never really a surprise when we end up at that destination. There has been flags, and it's just tuning into knowing what they are. Gastrointestinal problems, again, your gut is a muscle, so it has an impact here. Irritability, decreased concentration and impaired judgment. Again, that impact of our hormones on our brains. And with that, you have muscle strength kind of decrease. You're not feeling good. You're not feeling you're maximizing your opportunities. In my opinion, this is one of the most important slides we're going to discuss. REDS, I suppose if you ask me honestly, one of the biggest thing about it and one of the biggest preventatives of REDS is acknowledging that it exists. Information is power, knowing that it's there and that what you can do to avoid it. And it doesn't mean you actively spend your sporting career avoiding it, but I suppose, as I discussed there, flags means what can you do about it? What can you control? So fueling your body, avoid underfueling. Prioritize rest days, and recovery. In these days, it is important to use rest days to recharge both physically and psychologically. So naturally in competitive environments, doing an extra mile or going again, you do need to remove that kind of stressor off your body. So it is important you listen to it. Sleep, there is a lot of evidence kind of for both males and females with regard to sleep hygiene, and the scientific guidelines at the moment are suggesting between 8 and 10 hours. How you can get better sleep can be to avoid caffeine past 3 p.m, allow your room to be dark. Temperature of the room, whatever is comfortable for you, but they often suggest a little bit cooler than too hot. where possible, you know, I look at your brain as a muscle. So having a bit of a wind down routine is important, particularly if you're someone who ends up training late at night, be it with whatever sport or as time allows. That naturally, you know, that is an increase in blood flow. You have a lot of energy, but I often find, you know, you're sitting thinking of what you did, what you need to do, that having a journal, giving your body that space, but then parting with it, and things like avoiding blue light, you know, 30 minutes before you're trying to sleep, is quite important. Things then like training smart. Generally in high performance and in normal settings, there's no need to exercise beyond what is expected or planned. Obviously in preseason aspects now, it is all fine, everyone's doing their own bit, but when you're in peak competition, you know, running every day or doing extra gym sessions doesn't necessarily benefit you to kind of give you that extra 1%. In often cases, it can kind of start a cascade around that. So this is the second time this image is up here, but I promise I won't echo too much. So it looks like that triad on the left. It shows how RED impacts some of our body systems, and the diagram explores this. So once that kind of domino effect goes off, you know, our immunity, we know at around a time just before ovulation, just at the time of our period, we are more susceptible to illness, down to that low level of both our hormones from a protective standpoint. So the triad here will be my main focus as well, but that, you know, you look at your gastrointestinal, your psychological, your growth and development, and your endocrine system. So on the right then is a diagram of the effect on our athletic performance. So REDs, you know, again, all of these things can occur individually. It's when they occur in the absence of a consecutive, kind of 3 consecutive missed periods. So you can have decreased muscle strength, decreased endurance, increased injury risk, decreased training response, you know, nothing here that we haven't touched on before, but it just shows that some of this can make an awful lot of sense, and that hormones don't just impact, you know, our reproductive system. So with that, if you kind of look at tuning in, and I'm sure there's a number of people on this call who might be on contraceptive, I suppose I am not a medic or trained medic in this field, and it is difficult to interpret the role due to the variety of options. So the evidence that's out there, no 2 people are on this combined, and then there's different forms of hormonal contraceptives. So it is quite difficult to standardize a study. But what we do know is the contraceptive pill is designed to prevent pregnancy and manipulate a cycle. It is poorly understood in the research, but what has been shown is that it has no changes in strength or high intensity performance between pill taking and pill free taking days. And there has been like a number of, particularly in the UK, is just probably where a lot of this volume of research has occurred, that 49% of high performance Team GB female athletes are on a form of hormonal contraceptive. Out of a lot of it is around anxiety around performance days and just avoiding possible leaking and things. But thankfully, I'm sure anyone on this call has been aware that the tide is changing, and there's been a lot more conversation around, you know, changing from white shorts or white uniform to something a bit more neutral, so that it removes that anxiety around anyone trying to perform at the top of their game. Tracking is a way of tuning in. It's a way of applying concepts and tips and things that we've discussed, you know, in tonight's conversation. I appreciate some parts of it can be quite saturated, but for you to apply and put concepts of what we chatted about down, you can use pen and paper. There's a lot of apps such as Fitter Women and Flow. And what could be useful to track is when your period starts, when it ends, and kind of do this over 3 cycles, because you don't know, sometimes you can have one with a particular reason it's incredibly short, or there's a longer gap. So over 3 kind of gives you a general, you know, what your flow is, your symptoms, your sport performance, how you felt going in, how you felt, did you train well, did you recover well, did you sleep well? And it doesn't have to be overly rigorous, but just tuning into these things, and obviously aspects of, if you wanted to tie it into what you ate as well on this cycle, it can be a very helpful way to individualize and for you to optimize what is best, you know. I'm sure there would be people on this call as well who work with, I suppose, pregnant athletes, or it might be an athlete on this call who is pregnant. I suppose there's only emerging guidelines on this. The AIS research has actually only recently been published about 4 weeks ago, and they are emerging kind of, it's not one size fits all, and it needs to be liaised with a trained medical professional. You need to be someone whom I suppose is very aware, and if you are someone who's exercised before. But what we do know, And the research has shown, in terms of energy expenditure, pregnancy is like running a 40-week marathon. So it's one of the most energy demanding challenges on our body. So what we do know is that staying active is beneficial for regulating that, and not saying that pregnancy is a stressor, but it is really important that we acknowledge the task that is ahead and that we adapt, but we also train appropriately around that. And that needs to be individualized and needs to be safely done, liaising with an appropriate team. And then menopause is another stage of our female athlete phase in our life. Again, mixed evidence is out there down to everything we've discussed around options and what has been available to actually research. But what we do know is 38% of women who are 45 to 65 do not meet guidelines for physical activity. And we do know that activity can offset a risk of common health conditions, particularly associated quite closely with menopausal symptoms or stages of your life. So things like aerobic training, walking, low impact dancing, all these kind of things can be helpful alongside your activity that you might be doing. Weight bearing exercises, any, I suppose, performance athlete who's here and is of a menopausal age, it is important that, you strength train, and that is one of the most common themes I'm using throughout tonight's discussion, that it doesn't matter what stage of your life cycle or menstrual cycle you're on, if you are maintaining an element of strength training 2, max 3 times even a week, that you're boxing off the basics. So what I wish all female athletes knew, that 6% of the research in sports science is on females. Majority can transfer, but it is vital to individualize to what works best for you. Hormones don't just impact your reproductive system. So to be mindful of that that often there are flags, as we discussed way before we end up in a position where, that we notice things have gone off kilt. Gold medals and world records were set by females in every phase of their cycle. So like our menstrual cycle is not a barrier to our performance. Okay, we tune in, we learn, we adapt. Some people on this call are probably privileged enough to feel like it doesn't impact them at all, and that it is just being mindful that having a period or being on your period is not a barrier to performance. Be your own scientist. Just tune in, track, listen to your body, note when you recover well, note when you play well, what did you do, what stage you at, that type of thing. Listen to your body. Often when your body feels it needs rest, it needs rest. And it is not normal or healthy to not have a period. Bar if you're at a bracket of your life where you have not started your period, or you're in a menopausal phase where things are changing a little bit. In the midterm, unless you're on a form of intentional hormonal contraceptive, it is not normal for you to not have your period. And if that is something that you do, act on that. And just ask the questions and talk to the trained professionals and get the answer to get yourself right. And do the basics brilliantly, which is strength train, and strength train. My main summary then is your main take-home points. Train smart, so do as you need. Tune in. Talk to one another, to coaches, to professionals in different fields, and get that conversation going. And any concerns, please talk to a trained medical professional. On the right then is kind of bits and pieces of, thankfully, as we've had this conversation a number of years ago, we've been able to add to this, but these are just a number of Instagram pages I follow that I find quite beneficial. Your period of the period, Go with the Flow Coaching, The Athletic Female, and The Food Medic. Podcasts I find quite beneficial. The Food Medic, again, Dr. Hazel Wallace is probably one of the early doors people I started to follow who started this conversation, and probably used her very trained, evidence-based medical degree, but used it as a platform to influence positive kind of enforcement around being female and performing. At Your Cervix is also a podcast by Gráinne Donnelly and Emma Brockwell. They're based in the north and work with the NHS as well. But again, an Irish podcast that discuss topics like what we're having here, but easy listening to in the car, on walks, whatever suits. Books then that I've read, Period Power by Maisie Hill. It's actually just quite a good, easy read book. I think everyone who is female should read it. The Female Factor, again, Hazel Wallace. It's kind of a nice combination between talking about the science, talking about mood, talking about sleep, but also has like recipes. She's a trained nutritionist as well, as well as a GP. So it is important that, I suppose, it's evidence-based information. And anyone who I suppose is enjoys this and wants to geek out on it, I've recently read this book, Hormones, Health and Human Potential. It is a science book. It is a bit science heavy, so it might not be applicable for all. But it's formerly a female science book that has just been released. I saw it trending on Twitter amongst a lot of female health practitioners. Easy read if you have a science background, but definitely worth its while. So other than that, I will pass you back over to Eamon if anyone has any questions, and then give you back your Tuesday evening. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fiona. Just wait and see, is there any questions coming in, guys? Has anyone got any questions? I do have one question. In regards ACLs, Fiona, any particular exercises that you would recommend for ACLs, to ACL prevention, either in the gym or otherwise?
So yeah, it's again, it depends on I suppose the person's scope of exercise background, but I think everyone on this call has obviously an interest that I would be saying a single leg squat, keep it simple. Do you squat, do you deadlift, do you do a single leg exercise? Are you looking at something to control your lateral hip? Absolutely. Then if you want it to be more complex and do a single leg landing, but I often just think basics brilliantly. Get really strong quads, and just control your landing so that your knee isn't falling in too heavy. But look, everyone moves individually and you can't change how you biomechanically have moved your whole life. But if I had to give a general prescription to everyone on this call: squat, deadlift, single leg, lateral hip, and do a bit of a calf raise or a jump if you fancy, and you won't go too far wrong.
Super. Brilliant.
I'll just double check that this isn't coming through here in case anyone. Perfect.
Yeah, no, I think we're all good. So there's a couple of questions here around a couple of people saying thank you. And then there's also a couple of people asking around the recording. So the idea will be, please let it work this time, that we will actually be able to put the recording up on www.sparc.ie/female-athlete. So basically where you register for the event, and I'll probably stick an email around just to kind of let you know when it's up, so that you can kind of go back and have a little look at various bits of it, and pick it apart for the next little while anyway. Probably up for a couple of weeks there. Obviously we're very fortunate to have two women on tonight that have basically put that together for us, and we hugely valued their time and their effort in doing that. So massive bit of us from me anyway, and I'm sure from everyone going by the comments in the call, massive bit of us to both of you, and thank you so much for giving your time this evening, and thank you to everyone for listening this evening as well. So with that, I think we will pull the plug on this evening, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.